What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of First Fruits of Zion Reacts. And today we're looking at a selection from a Daily Wire series on the Gospels, I think. And the last one of these that we did was okay. They had some good things to say. So we'll see this time whether what we have to say about this from the perspective of a Messianic Jewish teaching organization. The Word in John chapter 1 is the topic of discussion. So that's a big one.
Can somebody explain to me, because I admit I've wrestled with this as long as I've studied Christianity. In the beginning was the Word. I've never fully understood that, especially if it harkens back to Genesis. I don't have an issue with it. Please understand, this is truly a question from ignorance. Is the Word, when God said, "Let there be light," is that the Word that's being referred to?
The Gospel of John gets mystical, okay? And there's mysticism in the Bible. There's people who are uncomfortable with it because other kinds of mysticism, like New Age mysticism, I think in some people's heads it all sort of gets scrambled up together, and so that when they see mysticism in other places, it's like, oh, that's the same thing. But Judaism has a long mystical tradition. When you're dealing with questions of who is God, or maybe more of a thorny question like what is God, you end up in sort of a mystical zone here, and that's what John is doing. John is using some Jewish mysticism here to say something about God and about the Master, Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah. To approach this kind of mysticism and come away with the phrase like, "Oh, I understand it," may be an overstatement for the vast majority of people who are going to encounter this stuff. It's okay not to understand the depths of Jewish mysticism. That's okay. It's tough.
The idea is to say, I think this is ultimately the Christian understanding, is to say that the God speaking is not created. When God speaks, it's not something else than Him. It is in some ways separate from Him, but also God. This is coming to love that Bishop Barron was going to talk about. That
the God who creates in the Old Testament is not created. That's correct. And maybe he's getting this from that because the Christians had a problem with some heresy back there at the beginning, with people who thought that the God of the Old Testament was sort of a bad guy, kind of an idiot. He was a demiurge, demiurge, I don't know. And he's just the blind creator God who created the physical world, and physicality is all evil, and only the spirit is good. And this was a Gnostic belief. I don't know if that's the point of John chapter 1, is to say that the creator God is not created. It's certainly a Jewish belief. I don't know that John necessarily needs to say that. He may need to say that to his audience. If he's writing to Gentiles, he might need to remind them, because they may not have grown up with the idea that there's only one God, creator of heaven and earth. The idea that the creation, that the Word gains some identity somehow separate from God, but not separate from God. It is sort of, we are dancing around the idea here.
That God speaking is His own being that is speaking into the world.
It's His own being that is speaking into the world, yeah. Yeah, the identification of God's Word with God Himself is something you'll find in Judaism. I think of like Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin wrote Nefesh HaChaim. He gets into this in chapter 4. He talks about how someone's will is essentially coterminous with one's true self. Who you are at its most essential level is sort of what you want, and that defines you. So when God gives the Torah, He says, "Here's what I want people to do." The Torah is in some sense coterminous with God, not in a metaphysical sense, but to understand the Torah would be to understand God at some level. So there's a similar idea there in Judaism. I don't know how this guy would react to that. But we'll do a little comparative religion here.
You would understand this in the Genesis context, is that there's an insistence on something like the primacy of the process that extracts the order that's good out of potential and chaos. And that's the word. And the Christian insistence is that Christ embodies the pattern of loving sacrifice that characterizes that word. And so that idea is something like the foundation of existence itself is the spirit of loving sacrifice. And that's equivalent. It's the same thing as the word that extracts the order that's good out of potential at the beginning of time. And when
the way he's wording it is sort of foreign to me, but I can pick out individual ideas that you can easily find in Jewish sources. The idea that what God did through the creation process was to extract or order out of chaos is not entirely dissimilar to what you might find in Nachmanides in his commentary on Genesis chapter 1, where he talks about how the tohu and bohu is equivalent to this Greek idea of this formless, shapeless something. It was something. It wasn't nothing, but there wasn't anything to it. Wasn't any structure or order to it, and that God sort of shaped that into everything that He made. Yeah, and the idea that the essence of God's spirit is loving kindness. You find this idea that God is love that you also find in the Gospels. That's in Judaism. And Judaism has these sephirot, Jewish mysticism has these sephirot, these emanations of God that are also just identified with God's very essence or person. And when you look at them in their hierarchy, loving kindness is up there at the top. Once it starts getting down out of the more cerebral aspects of it into how God feels and how God begins to interact with the world, loving kindness sort of trumps everything else. And so there's parallel ideas here. He's putting them together in a way that I haven't necessarily seen in a Jewish source, and using terminology I haven't heard from Jewish sources, but I'm seeing little elements of it.
One way of understanding that more prosaically, I would say, is that imagine the order that you establish in your family. If that little microcosm of the walled garden, your family, to the degree that you embody the spirit of loving sacrifice as a father, then you'll create out of the potential that's your family relationships, the order that's good. And it's sacrifice because, well, that's what you do on behalf of your children, right? You put them first, not you. You certainly put them first before your whims. You put what's best for them before their whims too. And so there's an upward aim in that, and all that upward aim is sacrificial. And then we get to the issue of what constitutes the ultimate sacrifice, which is partly what's explored in the gospel accounts. It's obviously explored in Abraham, because Abraham is called upon to make an ultimate sacrifice. But this is an extension in a different direction.
The idea that the act of creation involved a sacrifice on God's part sounds kind of weird. There's a similar Jewish idea to that as well. The idea that God is infinite. God is infinite means infinite, right? If something is truly infinite in this metaphysical sense, this particular sense that I'm talking about, there's not really room for anything else to exist. Because as soon as there's something that's not you that exists, you're not infinite anymore because you're not that. So Jewish mystical theologians seizing on this idea postulated that in order to create the universe, the physical universe full of matter and energy, God had to do something that we might call contraction. You got to make a little room for something else to exist. And this is these ideas, again, these are things to think about. If this is an idea that bothers you, don't think about it too much. But it's an interesting question. What does it mean for an infinite God to create something that's not Him? Doesn't that mean that now? Doesn't that entail some kind of self-restriction? And then we see God continuing to restrict Himself with covenants and promises that He makes to people. And you can see throughout all of that God's loving kindness, I think. So again, not entirely dissimilar, not entirely foreign. Well, maybe stated in a different way than I would.
One thing I would say in response to your question is the Logos being talked about here is the interior word of the Father. So the word of creation is more of a word that goes out. But within the Godhead itself, there's an interior word. The Father has an imago of himself that we call the Son. The Father and Son fall in love with each other. The mutual love is the Holy Spirit. So we would see from the beginning, this very text, there's a Trinitarian overtone. But it's the word that in a way precedes the word of creation. It's interior to God himself.
I'm not going to sit here and say that John the fisherman couldn't come up with a whole theological system like that sort of on his own, and whether that maybe these things could have been revealed to the apostles. I'm not going to say that's not possible. What I think is more likely is that when John appropriates this terminology of the Logos, I don't think that he's invented it. He's not taking a word and using it to express a bunch of completely new ideas. That's not what I think is happening. I don't think he grabbed the closest word that he could find, and then disconnected from all the things it meant before, or that could have meant to anyone else, shoehorned a bunch of his own theology into it. I don't think that's what happened. And I don't think we need to look too hard at Philo of Alexandria. He's a really interesting guy, and his ideas may have filtered up into the Galilee. Alexandria is kind of a long way from the Galilee if you're traveling even on a horse. But what I think is more likely, let me grab it. I'll grab it. Top shelf. What I think is more likely is the thesis laid out in this book, which is that when John uses the Greek word logos, he is recalling a word found in the Aramaic targums, or several words found in the Aramaic targums, namely diber and memra. And all of this actually probably from more of a conventionally Jewish perspective, and told in a way that I personally find more interesting and edifying and easier to understand than this academic monograph, which is also good, is in Chronicles of the Messiah. Chronicles of the Messiah, Torah Club Volume 4, Chronicles of the Messiah, which you can get at FFOZ.org. The first chapter lays all of this out. But essentially, if I were to try to summarize it here, in the Targums, because more than one, Targums are Aramaic translations of the Old Testament. And at the time that the Targums were being translated, the people, the sages of Judaism and the people doing the translation work wanted to make it clear to everybody that God did not have a body. God, when it says in the Bible that God spoke, like we're talking about God speaking and this being the word a few minutes ago. When God spoke, it's not exactly the same thing as when you speak or I speak, because we're made of meat. And the sounds that we make come from this human throat and lungs, and when God speaks, he doesn't have vocal cords. Right? God doesn't have a tongue. Okay. So when the Bible talks about God speaking, or God's right arm smashing the enemy, or God's eyes running to and fro throughout the earth, the Targum will often, not always, but often replace God in a sentence like that with the word of the Lord, the memra of the Lord, or the diber of the Lord. And these are just Aramaic terms that we would translate as word. And what the translators, and this is the thesis here in John Rowning's book, and I think it's right, I think he does a very good job of explaining it, is that the translators of the Targums wanted to avoid giving people the impression that God was just like a really big person, like he's a giant, and like literally his footsteps made the valleys and pushed up the mountains, things like that. They wanted people to understand, like Jesus said in the Gospel of John, God is spirit. So they say, well, it was the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord came to someone and said this, or the word of the Lord, whatever it might be. It's avoiding anthropomorphization, because God's not God's not a man. The Bible's pretty clear on that. It says, literally says God's not a man. So, and the Targums were created so that the people who didn't speak Hebrew, which is a lot of people there in first century Israel, that they would still be able to hear what God said. They spoke Aramaic as their first language. So these translations were created so the Targums are going to be what people are hearing in the synagogue. This John, the disciple, the beloved disciple of Jesus, was growing up he would be hearing from the synagogue. He would be hearing this stuff. He wouldn't have been interacting directly with the Hebrew words of the Torah. He would have been hearing the Aramaic translation. And so he would have had this vocabulary that there is this thing called the word of the Lord. And every time God interacts with creation, it seems like he's doing so through this intermediary. And it's not like it's not God doing it. It's not like God tells someone else, "Hey, go do this." It's not like an angel or messenger. But it's also not like God takes the Play-Doh into his own hands and sort of rolls up the earth like a ball. There's some sort of intermediary step or something like that there. And that's what John is drawing on mostly when he talks about the word. He's talking about a concept from the Aramaic Targums, and I think we run into weird territory if we think that this guy, this fisherman, went out and that studied a whole bunch of Greek philosophy and then brought back a bunch of ideas and said this is what Judaism has been missing the whole time. We don't think that was what John was trying to do. We think that he was really operating from a first century Jewish perspective, maybe more even of like a Galilean perspective. So that's just who he was. That was his perspective. So consider that instead of trying to see later Christian doctrines that weren't clearly articulated until the creeds, some later creeds, trying to read those back in as if John came up with those himself, but didn't say them clearly, but instead used these mystical terms to say them. Try to encounter John first of all in his own time, in his own culture.
Word was God, as it says.
May I just add to that in terms of the text? There were two words here that are very difficult to translate into English. And one, of course, is logos, which can mean, obviously, word, proposition, meaning, story. I mean, the resonance of that word is very rich. But also the word that's translated as beginning, the arche, because in the Greek philosophical tradition, that word is used for God. So, and there are reasons why this should be the case, but the arche is a term which has a very powerful theological meaning within the Greek philosophical tradition. It's the first principle. It's the source of all reality. So one way of looking at this is to say, well, in the source, there was the word. To say the Trinitarian reading, although that sounds like an absurd Christian introjection of a much later period, you could see that as making perfect sense with just these initial words.
John.
And if John were a Jewish philosopher, that would all be relevant. But he's not. He's a Galilean fisherman. He's a Jewish mystical theologian, sure, but he's writing in Greek. John's writing in Greek because he wants a lot of people to be able to read it. That was the lingua franca. He's not writing in Greek so that he can draw from any different Greek philosophical traditions. I lean more toward not all the way into Brad Young's camp on this, or the Jerusalem school of the Synoptics, but the idea that I think we can at least say that these Jewish people who grew up speaking probably Aramaic are they're formulating their ideas in their Semitic language, right? And probably in Aramaic. Some people think it's Hebrew. I think it's probably Aramaic. They do not, as soon as Jesus comes back from the dead, trade in their Jewish worldview for a Greek worldview or for a Greco-Roman worldview. These, to the end of their ministry, they continued to operate within what we would just call Judaism. It wasn't, I guess after the temple was destroyed, you can't call it Second Temple Judaism anymore, but it was still Judaism. It was its own, it wasn't hermetically sealed, but it was its own, its own thing. It wasn't Greek philosophy. John wasn't a Greek philosopher. But we need to resist the urge to grab a Greek word out of the New Testament and survey all of the literature written in Greek and say, here's all the things that word can mean. It can't mean all of those things to someone who's read all of that Greek literature. Sometimes it's a lot more useful to say, what's an Aramaic word that he might have translated into this? And what would that word mean? What would that word have signified to this guy, to the author of this New Testament work? And I think that'll get you a lot closer, because ultimately these guys have their own culture. It's a Jewish culture. It's a deeply reverent to God, reverent to the Torah. There were a lot of these Greek ideas would have been foreign. They would have been excluded from their world of thought. There wasn't as much synthesis going on with Greek thought as a lot of people want to think when they pick up the New Testament. The New Testament's very Jewish. It's in Greek, but it's very Jewish.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the fact that there's actually, I call them the 4 L's about God. There's love, agape, there's logos, there's light, and life. And these are all the identity claims that are somehow circling. And I'd like to propose we slow down a little bit, because the familiarity of those terms to us, I think, is masking something more profound going on here. And if we think about all of these, they're pointing, well, to me, they're pointing to something very radical here. They're asking us to get out of a normal way in which we think about reality in terms of stable, substantial, independently existing objects. All of these are inherently relational realities. And think about how profound that is, to say that ultimate reality is inherently, ultimately relational, and that therefore a relationship to it has to be primordially a relational thing. And this is very, very hard for our way of thinking, because we have got into the mode, and for all kinds of historical reasons we don't need, of thinking of, that what there really is are individual things. There's no relationality. This is, of course, nominalism. All of that's in our head, and then that gives us a dualism, because the mind has the patterns, the world. There's something going on here in this language, and I want to slow down a little bit and get at, right? These terms are very familiar, and I think I understand why they're there, but their familiarity is actually in some sense problematic, because I think it's easy, like these are all nouns, and it's easy to think we're talking about 4 things. These are attempts to disclose, and all 4 of them, I feel they're playing off against each other. The relation between them is as important as any one of them. And all of them are playing off against each other and trying to call us into a new way of trying to relate to ultimate reality. And so, like when I try and, because Jesus makes these claims too. He talks about, I'm the light of the world, abundant life, all of it. And this to me, if I could hear these words again, I could get to a place where I think the idea of could have more real relevance to me.
I got no idea what he just said. I'm not sure what idea he's pushing back against. It's nominalism or nomism, or nominalism and then dualism. I'm not familiar with that philosophical framework, but then again, I think probably neither was the beloved disciple. I think he's got something else going on. He's got his own way of seeing the world and seeing these things. That being said, to say that the ideas like love and life are identified with God's essence or with who God is, I think God is the author of life. God is the creator of life. God is the sustainer of life. God is love. But he said agape. It's chesed. We're try to think in Hebrew terms. God is chesed. He's loving kindness. And these philosophical frameworks, which are alien to Judaism, I think are just ultimately not super helpful. I wasn't even really able to follow what he was talking about. I'd probably have to go read a bunch of philosophy, a bunch of philosophy books that were written 1,800 years after the beloved disciple. It's more important to try to grasp what John is saying the same way a first century Jewish person would grasp it.
And so we live in metaphor. Metaphors aren't façon de parler. Like we've just begun, but I hope this discourse isn't too hard, but I hope we understand it. I hope you see my point. I hope you get what I'm saying. Like, try and say anything, right? Metaphor is not an ornament. It is part of the fundamental grammar of our cognition. And these are more than metaphors. These are metaphors that are trying to transcend themselves, and they're trying to point. And I'd like to also, I'd like to try and make sure we're not only paying attention to the text, we're paying attention to what is the mental framing, I'm trying to use that we're bringing to this text. I want this text to challenge me, and I assume that's what everybody is doing here. And so what is our stance, our orientation towards it, such that we can be appropriate to it, we can really listen to it very deeply?
It seems...
Yeah, being aware of the assumptions you're bringing to the text, the framework that you're bringing to the text is very important. And even every attempt that you make to shed that framework and adopt a more biblical framework only gets you part way there. It's a process you have to go through your whole life. You're reading a verse and realizing that when you've been reading the word life this whole time, and maybe it means something different, or a word like justification or sanctification, and suddenly it hits you like, wait a minute, the way that I thought of this word doesn't fit with this verse. My thinking about it was wrong or too narrow or something like that. When you're dealing with mysticism, there is a lot of metaphor. I remember Rabbi Akiva Tatz talking about this when he's talking about anthropomorphization in the Old Testament, and how he sees it from like a Kabbalistic perspective or a Jewish mystical perspective. And it's like, well, what you tell a child is that God doesn't really have hands. It's a metaphor for something else about God that we can learn. But when you become an adult, what you realize, or when you become initiated into the Jewish mystical tradition, what you realize is that God does have hands, but they're nothing like these. These are a metaphor. Our hands are a metaphor for something that God truly has. And it's not a physical, right? It's some kind of aspect of who God is. But either way, right? It's a metaphor. Either way, it's a metaphor. So sure, is life a metaphor? Is the word life a metaphor? Is this life? Is this real life? No. What we live now isn't the kind of life that we're going to have in the world to come. That's real life. There's a reason that some of the sages will call the world to come the land of the living, right? Because that's the time that the real life will be happening. Like Yeshua, Jesus is really alive now. Whereas we're just waiting to realize how dead we are. We're in these corruptible bodies, So what we call life today is a metaphor for a qualitatively different kind of life that we'll receive in the resurrection. It's important to be aware of those things. He laid out this framework that I didn't really understand, and then he cautioned us about bringing our own framework to the text. And I agree with the second thing that he said.
To me, that what John is establishing extending a radically non-materialist axiom. He's trying to identify what the core phenomenon of being is, and it's in this story. It's not material. It's being itself. It's very fundamentally associated, I think, with what modern people would call consciousness, which is a complete opaque mystery in and of itself, right? John is attempting to characterize the spirit of being itself, and he's making a claim. The claim is it's embodied in Christ. It's the same as the divine principle that generated order at the beginning of time. It's apprehensible. It's foundational, and it's also the fullest expression. This isn't directly in this text, but it emerges. It's the fullest expression of the tradition that's made manifest in the Old Testament. that emerges out of our primordial stories and announces itself as the principle of being itself. And it seems to me irrefutable that the principle of sacrifice is the basis of sophisticated psychological integrity and community. I just can't see how that cannot be true. And that's being pointed to here as well. Sacrificial love, it's something like that.
You know, is love the glue that holds a community together? The tradition says that John's last words were, "Little children, love one another." And you seeing "For God so loved the world," that verse is from John's gospel. First John, he says, if you don't love the other disciples, then you don't love God. So John does, in all of his writings, he brings this idea of love out. So I don't want to disagree in that sense. Just some of the terminology that I use, I feel like he's quoting something. He's quoting something I haven't read, emerging from our primordial stories. It's just not a phrase I'm familiar with. It's not a phrase I'm particularly equipped to make sense of. Maybe someone who has delved into the thought world and philosophy of Jordan Peterson could more delicately explain, or maybe compare and contrast that idea with something from Judaism. It just doesn't sound familiar to me from anything that I've read. He has a unique perspective. I wouldn't particularly call it a Jewish perspective. I just think a Jewish perspective can help us be a little more accurate. Is John trying to characterize the consciousness of the being, that the creator being? No, probably not. I think probably, it's only my opinion. I think probably John is writing to people who have generally apprehended the Jewish idea that there's one God, and he created the world. And he's riffing on that. He is riffing on Genesis, obviously, in the beginning. And if it's possible to understand and explicate what John is saying within that first century Jewish framework, I think we'll arrive as close as we can to apprehending John's meaning. That's my opinion.
For sure, the light, the life, and the word, they are things that make other things exist, in the sense that light is that which makes things seen, life is that which makes things move, and word is meaning that makes things happen. And so you can see that the analogies that John is putting together are there to say, like, if you don't understand what the word logos is, then light will bring you a little further. And if you don't know what light is, then life will bring you a little further. And like you said, it's not that one of those is actually describing anything, is that all of them playing with each other are pointing you to the mystery of the notion that there are invisible movers that make things move or make things happen, make things exist.
I think that
that sounds like Aristotle to me. It doesn't sound obvious, but again, the Jewish idea, God is invisible. Yeah, that's Judaism. God makes other things exist, and they don't exist independently of him. That's Judaism. Yes, it's sort of a collage of some Jewish ideas, but then some other ideas that whether they can be helpful to someone, I don't know. They haven't been particularly helpful to me so far.
it's helpful. But what I'm saying is, think about what we're saying here. Imagine going into a room of physicists and saying ultimate reality is love, light, logos, life, right? They're going to look at you and they'll either, well, that's very nice. It's a platitude, and they don't really believe it, right?
But they act out in their life.
They should.
I don't know what that has to do with anything. I think when we talk about Jewish cosmogony, or when we talk about Jewish mysticism and what it has to do with creation, and what God's love has to do with the actual fundamental underpinnings of the universe in the sense of physics, has little to do with the rules about how particles interact. The rule, there could have been any set of rules about how particles interact. That's not where you go to look for, well, where's God? Why didn't I see him in there when we activated the particle collider? it's sort of irrelevant. The physicist isn't. If there's, I think we're talking about existence at a higher level. We're talking about existence that is in an unseen way. You know, when you talk about, we've identified it's a force of gravity, and here's what it does. But like, why? Like, how? And so even if we find, it's a graviton or something like that, it's like, well, but why? Where did that come from? And what's keeping it going? Why are there rules in the first place? Why are there rules of physics? Why are there laws of physics? I mean, all these things should be pointing us to what's one of these guys might call an organizing principle or being. I don't think we need to be too hard on the physicists for not seeing love in the microscope. That's pretty normal.
But that's the point I want to make. But these things are not out there metaphors. You can't do science without these principles of intelligibility, right? They're right. And so I'm trying to wake us back up to. It's John's not making a scientific claim. I'm not saying that. That's ridiculous. But he's not saying something that's irrelevant to the scientific world.
He's making a meta-scientific claim.
Yes.
Right.
Thanks, James. That's exactly. And also
a meta-scientific claim would be a claim about science. Like if you were to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In the field of science, if you come up with a theory, you better have evidence for it. That's a meta-scientific claim. You're talking about science itself. You're talking about the process. You're not doing the process. You're talking about the process. Is John in John chapter 1 talking about the scientific method? No. I think when these guys say the word science, they're trying to make it broader than what most people mean by the term science. And I don't like that. I like using words in such a way that most people know what I'm talking about. I don't like redefining the word science to include whatever, or even meta-science to talk about whatever John is talking about in that first chapter of his gospel. That's how I don't want to follow that because I don't think it's fruitful. Because then what you do is you find something out there wherever you went, and you bring it back, and you say, well, this is why we can't trust any of the scientists because they didn't consider these things that we've discovered. It's like you can still run an experiment. You can run an experiment and see what happens. You get the same result every time. You can start making predictions. This is a process anyone can do. We don't have to gatekeep it for only people who have our specific philosophical, spiritual, theological paradigm. I just want to say that's not correct. It wouldn't be a correct thing to do.
this can be easily trivialized. That's my concern here. This can be, oh yes, that's very nice. Light, light, love. Oh, we like love, right? This, like, imagine proposing that relationality is that from which things emerge, rather than things are that from which relations emerge.
I jump in? I completely agree with what you're saying, and you're.
Do things emerge from relations, or do relations emerge from things? You know, the Hebrew word for thing is devar. You know what else that word means? Word. Think about that. That's all I got for whatever he just said.
Very close to Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. He said Trinitarian doctrine turned upside down the classical view. It said substance is primordial, relationship is accidental. Just the opposite. Ultimate reality is a relationship. Hence the importance of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And take the next step. Aquinas says this, that a creature is he says, quaedam relatio. It's a kind of relationship to the Creator. It has to be. If it's coming into being every moment from nothing, the creature is a relationship. Then I'd link it to Jesus' ethical teaching. Why do you love even your enemies? Because it's not so much substance against substance, but all of us are, whether we like it or not, connected to each other through God. So I think that's really an absolutely right intuition. And it's the metaphysics of this opening line.
I think it does.
I think I get it. I think I'm starting to get what they're saying here. So the Christians on the panel here have, they've done something that other Christians that we've done forever. which is they took a bunch of verses together from the New Testament, the Old Testament, and found this idea of the Trinity, and then they go and put it back in and start reading everything back through that lens. And this is a sort of reinforcement process, and you say, well, I've put enough verses together to where I have my system, my lens. Now I'm going to look at everything through that lens. I'm going to look at all the Bible verses through that lens, and I'm going to find stuff. I'm going to find more stuff than I could have found before. And so you take the Trinity and you read Genesis 1 through that lens, and you're like, oh, because God was a Trinity, the relationship preceded the creation process. And so relationship is ontologically superior to substance. All right. Here's the Jewish perspectives. Jews are pretty big on this idea that God is one, and so that this would be a foreign idea in Judaism to my knowledge of it. Not to say that there may not be some mystical ideas that are parallel here. I'm just not familiar with them. There's a lot of Jewish mysticism I'm not familiar with. Maybe you can maybe you can spot some Jewish mysticism on the shelf back there. Have I read it all? Absolutely not. I haven't turned 40 yet. That's what I tell people. Waiting to turn 40. Maybe then. I recently told someone maybe you have to taste 100 flavors of joy and sorrow before you can really start digging into the philosophy and the mysticism. I don't know. Most of these guys have gray hair. I wouldn't be on that panel. Not old enough. But here's what I think. I think this guy is 100% correct when he says that we are all connected to each other through God, because it is God's continual action of loving renewal of creation that we continue to exist at all. And I think there is a strong idea in Judaism that when you see another person, you are sort of encountering God in disguise in a certain way. It doesn't mean that we're all God. It's not what it means. But there's a sense in which when you encounter another person, even your enemy, that you are encountering God. You're encountering someone who's made in God's image at the very least, but even on a deeper level. This is someone, if God wanted that person to disappear, they would, and they haven't. So this is, you're encountering God as you encounter creation, in a sense. We're not talking about pantheism or panentheism here. We're talking about mysticism, and that's different.
Dovetails too within space and time. It's very interesting, Douglas, you said that in the word for beginning is God, right? And so this goes into, John, the discussion of, well, what is a cup, right? A cup it's designed for a certain purpose. It is also the purpose, and the end of it is also what it's intended to be. And so there's a circularity too. In God was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That temporally, this is that same fractal thing that's also being expanded across time and space, that the meaning is embedded in the object as it exists, what its use is and what its end is are all simultaneous.
Well, my head hurt trying to listen to that. Maybe I've been at this for too long. Maybe he goes on in the actual series to talk about it more. Maybe that's like a teaser. Riffing on the word beginning. If you want to see some serious riffing on the word beginning, I mean, check out the first however many chapters of Genesis Rabbah. What does that word mean? I would guess there's more commentary on that word in Jewish literature than on any other word in the entire Torah, because there's a lot of things it could mean. There's a lot of references it could be making, and there's a lot of parallels you can draw to other things. And that, I think that kind of study in the Hebrew is potentially more fruitful than saying, it was translated, this Greek word in Greek culture meant this other thing. Let's use that as our basis for further discussion. I'm not even going to say that the sages never do that. When Ramban likens the tohu and bohu of Genesis chapter 1, the without form and the without void of Genesis chapter 1, to some kind of pre-creative substance, he uses a Greek word. He says the Greek word for it is this. So they do engage. They engage with Greek culture. They translated the whole Torah in a Greek in the Septuagint, and that's a very highly within like Jewish lore. It's the story around the creation of the Septuagint. It's a very highly regarded translation. But I just think if we're going to be doing this really difficult work of trying to decipher mystical concepts, whenever possible, try to keep the guardrails there to where you're staying within a Jewish space, and I think it'll be more fruitful. If your goal is to understand John, then understand him as a first century Jew, not as a Greek philosopher, not through the lens of a more defined theology that came later. Whether or not maybe the Greek philosophy is correct and maybe the later theology is correct, that's not the point. The point is to understand John and his time and place as your starting point, and that will give you a direction. That will give you a direction as you seek to continue to understand what he's trying to say throughout the whole gospel. Is to understand what he thought he was saying to the people he was writing to in the first century as an observant Jew who grew up steeped in Judaism, Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy, Jewish theology, Jewish ideas, and probably the Aramaic language, maybe Hebrew, but probably the Aramaic language, which would have been the language that Jews spoke in that time and that they would have used to communicate theological ideas to each other. The fascination with the Greek language and the Greek philosophy, it's a little too much. I think it's a little too much if you want to get back to what John was after, what John was trying to do when he wrote that gospel. He wrote it in Greek. He wrote it in Greek because that's what people wrote in. It was the lingua franca. He wasn't thinking in Greek. He wasn't drawing on this vast array of Greek literature when he wrote John. All right, well, this was interesting. If you understood some of the things I didn't understand in this video, tell me in the comments. Upbraid me in the comments for not reading enough philosophy, and help clarify these concepts for me. And if you want a really Jewish take on John chapter 1, again, go get Chronicles of the Messiah. Chronicles of the Messiah, First Fruits of Zion, FFOZ.org. Go find Torah Club, Chronicles of the Messiah. Hopefully maybe we'll throw a link to that in there. It's expensive. It's expensive to get Chronicles of the Messiah. But if you become a First Fruits of Zion friend, they'll give it to you for free. Go become a friend. Support our ministry, and you can get Chronicles of the Messiah for free. It's the best commentary on the Gospels that has ever been written. You can get it for free. All right. Thanks for watching.